Okay, so in the first two parts of the lecture, what we've done is to basically go over the origins of the civil rights movement, especially why World War II was so important. And then we talked about the first phase, which was really galvanized by the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So what we're now going to kind of move into is what began to happen after that first phase. And what we're going to start to see is in the second phase, which runs from about 1960 to 65, around in there. Again, these dates aren't really set in stone. But we begin to see a shift. We see a shift in tactics, in goals, and in who the most prominent people of the movement were. So let's move down. There were some groups, certainly, that thought that the tactics of the first phase, that thought that the legal cases and the boycotts, that they were not producing change fast enough. Now remember, Brown, the decision was in 1954. By 1960, we still didn't have, widespread school desegregation. Now, this shift in phases certainly doesn't mean to say that King lost all prominence. I mean, that definitely wasn't the case. He continued to be very active and very prominent across the nation. But what happens is we begin to see a new group sort of coming to the forefront and leading the most radical part of the civil rights movement, and that would be students. So we see a change beginning in about 1960 from the NAACP and its legal strategy and the protests to something very different. The young people who were very excited by the election of Kennedy really inspired a lot. Again, but because they were disappointed in the speed at which things were happening. And remember, too, it's important that these young people were the ones who were most affected by all this, if you're talking about desegregation in schools. So these directly affect and involve young people. So what we start to see beginning in 1960 is that college students and some high school students begin to organize challenges to segregation. This started in Greensboro, North Carolina in February of 1960 with the first sit-in. And what students would do, and they typically, a lot of them were choosing Woolworths as targets. They would go into Woolworths, which had a segregated lunch counter. In other words, the counter was basically just for whites. Sometimes they didn't even serve blacks, and Woolworths was sort of like a drugstore if you've never heard of one. But they would let African Americans buy stuff at the store part, but would not allow them to sit down and eat. So groups of these college students would go into these Woolworths and they would sit down and wait and demand to be served, which of course they weren't. What also happened is the wait staff would get very confused over what to do because they'd really never encountered any kind of resistance before. So you have, waitresses dropping plates and counters closing down entirely rather than serve people. You also see quite a good bit of violence. White mobs would get wind that a protest was going on, and they would go in and beat the protesters up, or they would squirt ketchup on them, or the police would mistreat them as they were arresting them. The students had trained very, very carefully. They actually went to sort of schools and went to classes to understand how to be nonviolent in these situations, and that was a really key point of what their ideology was, that they had to maintain nonviolence even if they themselves were getting hit or they wouldn't fight back. This tactic of the sit-ins proved really, really successful. Quite a few lunch counters decided to desegregate and serve black customers as well as white. And part of this was sort of a realization on these business owners that, they can be the targets of this and therefore have no customers, or they can have both black and white customers. And so they saw it as a beneficial business decision. Students were increasingly dissatisfied with King and his leadership as well, and really wanted to change the model of how the civil rights movement was organized and led. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, was very much sort of a individual-centered leadership. And so what I mean by that is that there's one face, and that was King, really. And then some of the other leading ministers were very prominent too, and they were the ones who would do the speaking. And it was very much sort of a top-down kind of thing, where the people would, King and people would go into Birmingham or go to other places, and they would give a speech, and then they would leave. So there wasn't a lot left behind after they left. And SNCC, this group that the students formed called SNCC, it's an acronym, SNCC. It stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC. SNCC was a group that the students formed primarily out of opposition to King and the SCLC, because the SCL, again, was very adult, very male, very sort of, they would kind of have control over the organization. The students wanted something different, and they were really assisted in developing this organization by a woman named Ella Baker. This is her. She had been involved with the SCLC for quite a long time. She had been involved in positions within the government before even. She had been very active in the civil rights movement, had actually more experience in civil rights activism than all of the ministers, the men combined, but was sort of treated as subservient within the SCLC. They saw her as a secretary. They had her taking notes and filing rather than doing things or deciding what the group was going to do. And so she was getting very frustrated with the male-centeredness of the organization as well. So she helped the students form this new group called SNCC, and they had a very different view of leadership and a very different view of how activism should take place. They were very group-centered. So in other words, the whole group got to make decisions and got to have input into what to do. They also were very, very interested in grassroots organizing, to the extent that they really wanted to go into an area and help educate people there to continue to educate people, so that when they left, there would still be stuff going on and people would know how to do things. So this is something that SNCC really was very, very interested in. Getting the local population to begin to work rather than just sort of going in a speech or an event and then leaving and not leaving anything behind. One of the tactics that the students used, in addition to the sit-ins, were freedom rides. The freedom rides began in the spring of '61. These have been attempted before in the 1940s, so this wasn't a brand new sort of thing, but the freedom rides beginning in '61 were basically groups of students, integrated black and white groups of students, and they were getting on buses beginning in Washington, D.C., and they were intending to travel down to New Orleans, but they wanted to travel down through the South and to test segregation laws along the way. So they wanted to, like, when they stopped at a bus stop, the white students would drink out of the black-only water fountain, or they would the black students would sit in the white section. So they were kind of testing segregation laws as they went, and obviously violating state laws in some ways as well, many ways as well. They were doing fine until they reached Anniston, Alabama. And when they reached Anniston, they encountered violence. A huge white mob attacked them with pipes, slashed the tires of the buses. Someone threw a bomb through the window of the bus as people were trying to escape. The riders were trying to get out, and someone threw this bomb in. The white mob was beating them as they came out. Here are some images of that. And they then also sort of hit this kind of resistance as they got to Montgomery as well. So they encountered tremendous amounts of white resistance and violence once they got into Alabama. Local authorities in Alabama did not do anything for the Freedom Riders. They basically said, hey, it's their fault. They're the ones who are taking this on themselves. They're responsible for this violence against them, sort of blaming the victim sort of approach. And, so they pretty much ignored the problem and allowed this violence to take place. President Kennedy was pretty much therefore forced into action. He was pretty reluctant to do anything as well. He had been elected by a very narrow margin. The South was very important to him because he was thinking about re-election. And he was, not wanting to alienate the South by doing something too radical with civil rights. So he was kind of forced into action. But the violence had been on television, and this is something that was a really big deal, that because it was in the press, because it was on TV and in the newspapers, that lots of people saw it, and it produced a lot of outrage. So Kennedy called out the U.S. Marshals, and they began to protect the buses and the riders for the duration of the trip. They normally didn't make it. They didn't make it all the way to New Orleans, but again, they sort of had to get Kennedy's attention through all of that violence. A lot of people in the civil rights movement. Oh, here are some more pictures. These are some of the people who were beaten. They're just images of when they had press conferences of their faces just being bloody and swollen. The man on the left, the African-American man, is John Lewis. He is very, very well-known civil rights activist. He's been in Congress, just a very well-known person. Anyway, so people were beginning to notice that violence was getting some attention, and not violence from the protesters, but violence by the whites. That was really sort of showing people, how bad the South could be, with these peaceful protesters just riding a bus, and then they get beaten up and, look like the pictures that I showed you. So the students were noticing that violence was getting results and that violence was getting the attention of the president, for example, as was Martin Luther King. And so in 1963, King decided to sort of work with this idea. I don't mean to make him sound cold. That wasn't, the purpose. But in 1963, he organized protests and marches and demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, in order to try to end segregation there. So these are the Birmingham marches. He picked Birmingham deliberately, primarily because of this man, the police commissioner there, who was a man named Eugene Bull Connor. And Bull Connor seemed to many to be sort of the living stereotype, everything you could think of a horrible racist white Southern sheriff. This was Bull Connor. So, King was going to Birmingham deliberately to provoke Connor and to deliberately see, if they could get some results that would get news coverage and that would, show people how bad the South was. When the marches started in Birmingham, Connor really wasn't having anything of it. He pretty much ignored them, didn't do too much about it. It seemed like this idea wasn't really working very well until King decided that one of the things that he was going to do with the marchers was to put young kids in with the marchers. As they marched peacefully, and they would march peacefully through the streets of Birmingham. Here are some images. You can see by what they were wearing. They were wearing church clothes. They were singing hymns as they walked down the street, very peaceful and orderly. It was only when King added the really young children to the marchers that Connor got really incensed and really, really angry. And began, having his officers attack them, basically. The officers would beat the protesters with clubs. They had police dogs that they would sick on them. They used fire hoses to try to break the demonstrators up. You see a picture of that here. How they explained that was that they were trying to cool the protesters down, that it was hot. Obviously, this is silly because that fire hose, it's a lot of pressure coming out. So we have this incident where Connor reacts violently, and these images are just all over everywhere and all over the media. Kennedy himself was watching on television, and he commented that, quote, "The civil rights movement should thank God for Bull Connor. He's helped it as much as Abraham Lincoln." And he didn't mean that Bull Connor was good. He meant that he is bad, that Bull Connor had done something so horrible that this would really push the movement forward to show people what things were like. And Kennedy himself and his brother began then working and intervened directly to help the protesters desegregate in Birmingham. So one of the things that came out of the early activism by the students, including the sit-ins and the freedom rides, was their growing realization that just working on desegregation wasn't really getting anywhere, and that desegregation alone was not going to help. So what they began to do was to shift more towards a new goal of political equality. And so they're going to be pushing for the right and access to the vote. SNCC, along with some other groups, began something called Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer began in 1964. Again, it was SNCC and other groups. There were a lot of college students, a lot of college groups involved. They decided to have a voter registration information drive in Mississippi. Again, like King had done with Birmingham, the students were the same way with Mississippi. They picked Mississippi because it was the worst possible example of what was going on with voting and blacks, that blacks just basically were not able to vote at all. And they knew that if they could accomplish something in Mississippi, that they could certainly, do something anywhere else. The students, because of their strategy and their organizing, they would go into the communities itself, and they would set up what they called freedom schools. And these are some pictures of what those would look like. But the freedom schools were basically, not formal schools, but the students would teach the local people how to take the voter registration tests for the reading tests, the literacy tests. They would tell them, they would talk to them about the Constitution and their rights under the Constitution. They would talk to them about history. So they would talk to them about how to balance their checkbook if they wanted to. Pretty much whatever the local people wanted, they would help them with. But the freedom schools were set up to help educate and inform the local people so that they could go out and also be organizing as well. And they would teach reading and writing, basic literacy, different kinds of things, vocational subjects. There was some who taught French, just different sorts of things. But anyway, so they were teaching these people how to become engaged political voters, basically. They very quickly realized that they were not going to be able to use the Democratic Party within Mississippi as a vehicle. The Republican Party just wasn't an option at all. But the Democratic Party was all white at the time and refused to allow blacks in. So the students decided to organize their own party, a new party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a challenge to the all-white regular Mississippi Democratic Party. So this new party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, they began registering voters for it and getting voters in. They were really successful. Lots and lots of people were coming in and registering to vote. This was met with a lot of opposition by whites, enormous amounts of violence. The students talked about how people would burn crosses on the yards of the houses where they were staying. The police would pull over and harass students. They would get beaten up. Mobs would follow them around. All kinds of horrible and violent things were happening. In addition to that, in June of that year of 1964, and remember this year is important because it's a presidential election year, right? Kennedy has been assassinated the year before, and so this is a presidential election year and very important politically for that reason. Anyway, in June, 3 civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. If you're looking at the missing poster right there, Chaney is the African American in the middle. The other 2 men, Goodman and Schwerner, were from the North. SNCC had actually recruited and incorporated some northern white college students on purpose because they were hoping that, if violence happened, that would show white people up in the North that this wasn't just a problem for the South. Anyway, but Goodman, Schwerner, and Chaney were murdered during the period. And again, other workers are going to face a lot of violence in the form of bombs and bomb threats and different kinds of things. So really high level of violence, and the students were expecting that, right? If they had a whole lot of violence just dealing with segregation, they're going to get even more if they're talking about political equality, which is a lot more important and a lot more pivotal to power and who organizes power. Again, though, SNCC was really successful in its attempt to register voters. It was so successful, in fact, with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, that they were able to go to the Democratic Convention in 1964. The Democratic National Convention was held in Atlantic City in 1964, and that's where the party will pick its candidate, who's going to run for it. Lyndon Johnson is going to be who's nominated, who took over for Kennedy. But anyway, the Mississippi, there was a weird situation. Every state sends one delegation. Well, this year there was a weird situation in that Mississippi sent 2. They sent the MFDP and then the all-white delegation as well to Atlantic City. The MFDP was led by a local woman from Mississippi. Her picture is here. Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a sharecropper from a sharecropper family. She was one of 20 children. Her, had experienced a lot of problems and prejudice as she was getting the group organized and as she was trying to register to vote. Anyway, so you've got these 2 groups coming in, the all-white group and the MFDP. And the Democrats have to figure out what to do. Who are they going to seat? Who's going to be the real representative? You can't have 2 of them running around. So the Democrats had a committee meeting, and they had hearings where they had people come in. This is Fannie Lou. This picture is of Fannie Lou Hamer. You can see the little poster in the back, the Credentials Committee. Fannie Lou Hamer was telling her story about the violence that she encountered and the difficulties that others encountered as they were registering for the right to vote. She talked about how she lost her job. Her daughter lost her job. They got a water bill when they didn't have running water hooked up to the house that was like thousands of dollars or something. So lots of kind of problems that she encountered and others did as well. The committee decided, and basically what Hamer was saying was that the MFDP was the legitimate party because they didn't lock people out. Anyone who wanted to register for the MFDP could, and that the regular party was not legitimate because it left people out. Anyway, so the committee met and was led by Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota. And LBJ was kind of pushing a lot of this too, but they worked out a compromise, and there were 3 main points to the compromise. The first point that the committee came up with, that the Democratic Party came up with, was that the white delegation would be the real delegation. So the all-white delegation would be the true delegation from the state. They said, though, that 2 of the MFDP members would be able to be delegates, at-large delegates. So they'd be able to be there and vote, but they wouldn't really be recognized as from the state. The third thing is really important, and that was that never again would the Democratic Party, the Democratic Convention, seat a delegation which discriminated on the basis of race. So they had this committee meeting and came up with this compromise. As you might imagine, neither side is happy with this compromise. Both sides absolutely hated it. The all-white delegation left. They stormed out of the convention because of it. They were really upset. And the MFDP actually for a while went and occupied their seats. The MFDP were also really, really disappointed. I mean, they had worked so hard. They had encountered all of this violence and had to go through all of this violence. 3 of their colleagues had died. And it just didn't seem like they were accomplishing anything. It didn't seem like they had gotten anything. And a lot of them started to get really, really disillusioned and angry, including leader Stokely Carmichael, who we'll talk more about in a minute. All was not lost for the civil rights workers, and I'll talk more about this later. But Freedom Summer and other actions by the students really prompted action by Congress and the presidency. So in the second phase of the civil rights movement, that is where all of this action and all of these protests is going to provoke legislation. So coming out of the second phase directly are 2 big pieces of legislation. Again, I'll mention them now, but I'll talk about them more later. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, now we need to see how this sort of closes up, how it ends up. So we'll talk about sort of what comes out of that really strong disillusionment and anger of a lot of the students over what happened at the convention, and then the accomplishments and the limitations in the next part.